So again, when we're talking about cinematic structure, you could take a look at my book, Shoot Your Novel, which is all about using cinematic technique, filmmaking technique to do your scenes. And I use a lot of examples of screenplays and novels to show how authors can take the same kind of effect or technique that screenwriters use to create really dynamic scenes. What do I mean? Well, think about these different camera angles. Back in the day when movies were made, I think of like Fred Astaire movies, they would do the entire dance number with one camera in the back of the restaurant room or wherever they're on stage doing their dance, and it would be one take, the whole entire dance. They didn't really do a lot of film editing way back in the day. So now when we see movies and TV shows and films, there's a lot of editing involved. So there's lots of different camera angles. I grew up in the TV industry. My mother was a TV screenwriter and story editor. She was a producer of a lot of shows. She created a lot of shows for television. My brother also was a TV producer and screenwriter. So I grew up on sets and I read a lot of scripts growing up. And one thing that really got ingrained into my brain as I read and also started writing at a young age was to think in terms of camera shots and piecing together those different angles. Whenever a scene is filmed, for instance, on a set, they'll always do it, like say there's a two shot with two people. And if they show part of the scene facing one actor from one angle, they take the opposite angle and then they do the whole scene again and they shoot the other person. They might piece it together. You'll notice how they'll flip back and forth oftentimes from one character to another. But again, this is all about piecing together these camera shots. And so if you can start thinking cinematically about your scenes and plotting them out in terms of where is the camera? Are you zooming in to see something important? Are you pulling back to reveal more of the setting? Those are elements that are going to really serve you well to write great dynamic scenes. So I've talked a little bit about point of view, about grounding your setting and your scene in your character's point of view. I also want to talk a little bit about point of view, character voice, because one thing that I think most writers don't really understand about writing in deep point of view is that every single word of every scene is your character's voice. That means every line, even when you're describing setting, even when you're just giving a bit of backstory, it has to sound like it's the character thinking. Okay, so when you're developing your characters, you need to really work on their voice. Each of them should sound unique, have their own voice based on their upbringing, their education, their ethnicity, where they grew up, who they hung out with, what their age is. There's so many factors that go into how a person talks. All you have to do is just listen to your friends and listen to people on TV, news people, whatever. And you can hear how each person really does have their own style of speaking and voice. And so you want to bring that into your story. The more you can develop a strong point of view character voice and bring it into the narrative in the scenes, the more powerful and more cinematic she writes these murder mysteries, the Inspector Lindley series that was also adapted into PBS series. And she goes very deep into her characters, even her minor and incidental characters. She'll do point of view scenes with them and go really deep into their voice. I think she might have had a desire subconsciously to be an actress because she actually just sort of becomes these characters and they just come to life. And they're so fascinating because of their voice. So scenes are really all about character voice. So keep that in mind, that everything that you're going to tell in that scene has got to sound like your character, feel like your character, express your character's mood or mindset. And the third M is also the motivation. You want to always hint as soon as possible in your scene what your character's motivation is for that scene. Why are they doing what they're doing right in this moment where you start? Okay, so keep that in mind. The third M I touched on, mood, isn't so much the mood of your character as it is the mood or tone that you want to set for the scene. If your character is in a funk and is feeling depressed, you're not going to use bright, happy language, and you're not going to show bright, happy things unless you're going to show them to be contrast with your character's mood. A person that's in anguish might go outside on a beautiful, gorgeous, sunny day where the birds are singing and the creek is bubbling and feel utterly broken because the pain that they're suffering feels so incongruous to the setting that they're in. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to start by taking a look at one of my worksheets. And I'm going to pull it up on the camera for you so that you can take a look at it as I talk about it. But let's go through some of this. It's called 8-Step Process for a Solid Scene, or 8 Steps to a Perfect Scene. So the first item when you're dealing with a scene, you're trying to come up with a scene. Of course, you can use this also when you're checking your scenes that you've already written, is to identify the purpose of your scene. And I know that sounds really simple, but it's really important. And I think a lot of times writers are missing this. They'll write an entire scene and I'll read it and go, what was the point of that scene? I actually did that today working on a critique. I just could not make any sense of this scene. Like, what was the point of it? It was a couple people doing some crazy stuff and talking and, going to a bar and getting in trouble and all that stuff. It had nothing to do with the plot, nothing to do with the premise. It had no purpose, really. And so every scene that you have in your novel really needs to serve a purpose. What purpose? To help advance the plot that's based on your premise. If your story is about a bunch of people that go rob a bank and then take that money and hide it somewhere and then then they have to try to find a way to get back to dig it up. You're not going to show scenes with these characters off at a dance party if nothing happens at the dance party. Everything that happens should be significant to move your plot forward. Okay. So number 1, identify the purpose of the scene. In one sentence, explain what you intend to accomplish with the scene. It should be simple. If you can't figure out what your purpose of your scene is, it sounds like you need to throw the scene out. Or maybe revisit it later or come up with some other details to the scene to make it work. So be sure that you know what purpose every scene is serving. And that speaks to the bigger picture, which is really being able to understand what scenes go where and what scenes you need. If you really are not familiar at all with novel structure, that's where you need to start. I would suggest that you get my book, Layer Your Novel, study it very carefully, and learn first of all what your 10 key scenes are. Each specific foundational scene needs to go in a specific place, and it serves a very particular purpose. Okay? So, identify the purpose of your scene. So let's say the purpose of your scene is to show that your character discovers a baby in a trunk that's floating in the bay where his fishing nets are tangled up after a storm. Okay, this is a scene from my novel, which one? Crystal Scepter, the 5th book in my fantasy series. So let's say I sit down and I think, okay, what do I need to have happen in this scene? I need to have him find this box and discover this baby. It's a really, really important moment. It's a high moment for my book, but it's also the key or high moment for my scene, which brings me to step number 2. Identify the high moment. What is the key moment your scene is going to build toward? Describe in one sentence what will happen and why it's important to your story. Okay, so I've got this scene. My old fisherman needs to find this baby in the trunk that's floating in his fishing nets in the bay after a storm. That's my high moment. The high moment is going to come at the end. At the end of my scene, he is going to find that box, open it up. He's going to discover this baby. He's going to find the gems, the little bag of gems, and the note from the queen saying, who this baby is, that he's royalty. Please keep his identity secret because his father is trying to kill him. Please raise him as your own child. And, that's a huge shocker for this man. And I've already set up that this fisherman had already lost his son in a fishing accident. His fault for being drunk caused his son to fall overboard and drown. So he's dealing with a lot of grief. This is a huge moment for him to have to decide whether he is going to raise this baby. And he's been given this another chance, he feels. So he needs to do it right. So I know what my high moment is. So then what do? I need to think about that 20 minutes, right? So I could have started the scene with Arnold, my fisherman, waking up in the morning and brushing his teeth and taking a walk along the bay and maybe eating breakfast and then maybe having a conversation with his neighbor and on and boring, right? Because first of all, readers don't want to hear about ordinary life. They don't want to read about boring, ordinary, on-the-nose stuff. So leave it out, right? I think it was Elmore Leonard that said, or maybe it was Huck Twain. You'll have to check me on that. Said, leave out the boring parts and just leave the interesting parts in. That's great advice, right? For all of us. So on identifying my high moment, I know where my character needs to be at the end of the scene. Your high moment is usually the last line of a scene or it's the last paragraph, okay? So when you read great novels, you'll see that each scene ends with a great high moment. If it doesn't, then it's not as good as it could be, okay? So you want to aim for an opening hook for every scene, which is basically your promise to your reader, and you want to end with some great hook, right? Okay, so now we're going to work backwards. Where would I start my character 15, 20 minutes before that moment? Okay, so I decide to have Arnold walking out of his door, immediately seeing all the debris and mess from the beach that the storm has caused. He has a little shack right on the coast, on the shivery coast in my town of Tolpuddle. And he goes outside, and I decided to make it the anniversary of his son's death. And so he's already very depressed. It's morning. He knows his nets are going to be a mess, his fishing nets, because he catches fish in the bay while putting nets out. And so I have him start heading over right away toward the bay. I'm not going to have him dawdle for an hour or two, right? So he heads over to toward the bay, and on the way he stops at the memorial, which is a little stone or whatever. I'm not sure what I wrote in the book, which I wrote quite a few years ago. But he heads over to the stone, and he's very depressed and emotional about having lost his son, and he's thinking about how guilty he feels and how his wife left him and all that stuff. Why do I do that? Because I need to punch home the high moment. What's the high moment? He's going to find a baby, and he's going to realize that he's been given a second chance to raise another son. And he feels that this is a gift, maybe even a test from God, that he has to do this. So, of course, it works really well for me to have him thinking about his son that he lost and feeling so guilty and feeling like he should end his life even. And so then he heads over and sees the nets, starts to untangle them, notices something bobbing in the nets, realizes it's a trunk, pulls the trunk up onto the dock, opens the trunk, finds the baby, horror, shock, the baby is alive. And, you know, as I mentioned, he finds this bag of gems, he sees a note, and then his moment is that he has to process this, right? So keep in mind, you want to always have natural action, reaction, processing sequence. And if you aren't familiar with that, you can take a free module on action, reaction at my online course at cslakin.teachable.com. Go click on Emotional Mastery for Fiction Writers. And when you get on that page, scroll down to where it says Action Reaction Preview in the curriculum. And you can watch this 38-minute module. And it's going to talk about how your characters need to act, then react. So what happens when you work on a scene is you have to decide what your character is going to go through in that 15 or 20 minutes. And then whether you're going to end on a note of action, reaction, or processing, because the cycle is action, reaction, processing, new decision, then a new action. And that's a cycle that can go many, many times over in one scene, or it might only be one of those in an entire scene. In a detective story, for instance, you could have characters processing for an entire scene. They just found a clue for a murder mystery, and they're talking about what that clue means. So they're processing. Okay. So it really just depends on your story and your plot and your genre, what type of cycle you're going to have, how quickly those cycles are going to move, and what is happening in your story. So here's the character at the end of the scene. He's reacting to this trunk he found, this baby, and then he starts to process, and he decides that he's going to head to town and go to his neighbor's house that just had a new baby, and get some milk, get some clothes. He's made a decision that he's going to raise this child. Okay. Our third step in this 8-step process for a perfect scene, after you've identified the purpose and you've identified the high moment and you've worked your way back 20 minutes or so you know where to start your story, is conflict, inner and outer. Describe the inner and outer conflict that will permeate this scene and what this conflict will accomplish. This is really, really important. If you have no conflict in your scene, it is useless. It's horrible. I will venture to say, as I always do, conflict is story. And you need to have conflict on every single page. It can be external conflict. It can be internal conflict. Conflict is tension. So what do I mean by conflict? It doesn't mean that you have to have people fighting on every page, but conflict is when anything just is rubbing against something else, right? So if you've got this character, for instance, my character Arnold, this fisherman, he's got a lot of inner conflict. There's no outer conflict happening in that scene, right? But the inner conflict is really high, and it's always the best, I think. It's better to have inner conflict than outer conflict to me. Again, if you're doing a thriller, a big suspense thriller, and there's a lot of chase scenes and stuff like that, the outer conflict is probably going to be forefront. But when you can bring in inner conflict, a character that's conflicted about things, that's facing a dilemma, a moral dilemma, or just having a hard time making a choice, even if it's a small choice, it can add tension and conflict. Of course, interpersonal conflict is great. But in my scene with Arnold, for instance, there's nobody else there in the scene but him. So for me to have conflict, he can either fight with some seagulls over the fish, or he can fight with himself. And of course, I created a lot of inner conflict for him in that scene because he's struggling with his guilt and his horrible feelings of loss that he's dealing with. So his inner conflict, of course, comes really into play when he finds this baby and he realizes somebody needs to raise it and he could just give it away. But he feels this sense of responsibility and also of fate and destiny, so that here's this inner conflict. He doesn't want to raise another child. It's not because he doesn't want the responsibility, it's he's terrified that he will make the same mistakes. He hasn't had a drink of alcohol in a year, but he's terrified that he's a weak man and that he will fail, and that somehow this boy, when he grows up or as he's growing up, might be endangered by him. So lots of inner conflict here. And if you want to know what happens in the story, you can read The Crystal Scepter.